cutting a key stock to length. Given a standard key stock, I want to cut about an inch off. We can measure that inch, roughly to about that location. Thumbs are handy. Mark, usually with a pencil. I'm using a pen, which does give me a fairly good indication of where it is. At that point, I put it in the vise so that mark sticks out just maybe about a 1/4 inch this side of the vise, not inside the vise, because obviously I have to run a hacksaw there. So about a 1/4 inch, I would say, is a good depth outside towards the camera here. Tighten the vise up around the jaws. Fairly snug. That'll be really too hard. Enough to grip it so that'll have a little bit of force. Now the trick is using a hacksaw. And using a hacksaw to cut, we always handle here, always cut on the push stroke. Not the draw, but the push stroke. Now in cutting, normally we draw, which is a draw back across this key. You can see a little better here, the key sticking out. I'm going to draw to cut a notch. Usually about 2 draws will do it. I put my finger against the side of the blade, not inside the blade where I can get cut, but over here. And the idea is to form a good solid notch. What that notch is a saw guide. Once I have that saw guide, then I'm going to use a push stroke. I think you can hear that, to cut the key. Now I'm going to use my left hand, even though I'm right-handed, because the idea on cutting is I cut on a push. I only draw back, but I push. And this is really, if I use my fingertips, see a little fingertip in there? That's about the force necessary. I'm really not going to bear down at all. Now, of course, this leaves a question of, why do I cut at an angle? Because in the area here that I'm cutting into, I want to make as small an area as possible. Because with the smallness of the area, it takes less force to get the same pressure. Or I can think of it as using less pressure, less area to get the same force for cutting. We're not trying to push the saw blade through the metal. After all, this is carbon steel. It's pretty strong stuff. Rather, we use the teeth to kind of score it, and keep scoring it. And through the action of repeated scoring, that's what cuts the key stock. Now go a little bit of a distance. And even with this little bit of talking here, I'm about, I would say 20%, maybe about 25% of the way through here. Now at this point, I'll change the angle of the saw blade. Say to be flatter at times. Occasionally more vertical. And the reason for that being is, again, I'm trying not to create a long, flat surface, because a long, flat surface will take more force to cut. Since it's a bigger area, it takes more pressure to get the same force. I really want to keep my areas really small that I'm actually cutting, like maybe 1 tooth teeth thickness at most, because if that's what I've got to cut, it's a lot easier to cut. And after all, I'm not interested in working for a living necessarily. I'm really more interested in how do I get a nice cut, as little effort as possible. If it takes an extra 20 seconds to cut, it's not that big of a deal. You don't ordinarily cut 100 keys in a day. You might cut 1 at most, get the motor installation done. Motor installations take a lot of work. This is a very small part of it. So an extra 30 seconds, 20 seconds is not a big deal. I keep sawing, and the reason for my right hand here is because this vise is not tied to the desktop like it should be. So I'm actually using my hand to hold the vise in place. And notice here I'm still horizontal. Now I'll go vertical for a while. And the lighter I hold this blade, the more easily it actually will stay in the guide and move. If when I press down, it'll tend to catch and bind. If I do a very nice loose touch, it will tend, on the push strokes, to actually cut metal. I'm getting a fair amount of dust here on the tabletop. And you can see we get just about to the end where it will just start to bend and falls off. At this point, we're not quite done. What we need to do is to deburr this edge. It's got lots of sharp edges still because, again, using a hacksaw and manual sawing, we don't ordinarily get the very best cut. Now, in deburring, we basically use our friend, the file, and it's kind of like woodworking. If anybody's ever done woodworking, really easy thing to do. Ordinarily, I'd pick up and run the file diagonally across each edge, flat edge of the file. Do that about once across that face, once across that face, once across that face, about a 45-degree angle, once across that face. Notice I'm going from the long edge, working my way to the short edge. Then I kind of gradually round off around the corners. And notice a twisting motion, pushing, wrapping around the edge. And at the very end of it, with that little bit of sawing, I don't recommend doing this at home, but I feel very comfortable scraping that cut edge on my arm. It takes very little effort to deburr, but you should always deburr because a manual saw motion will always leave some sort of burr that will sit at the metal and sharp edge will definitely cut.